Hello everybody. Let's think through the homework problems. Before I show you solutions, I think what's more useful is to think through how would you approach it if you're staring at a blank screen. Like how do you even get started thinking of solution approaches? So let's look at the first one. You read the problem. So we're going to return a string that's the first and last letter of the input string. So for example, if I'm going to shorten mellow, it's like I'm going to remove the ELL and I'm left over with just the M and the O. Before you can come up with a solution strategy, you have to have in your mind what are the basic things you can do with strings, because otherwise the solution strategy you're going to come up with might not be plausible. So for example, if I don't have in my mind what I can do with strings, I might come up with this solution approach. I'll say, okay, I'm going to take a string called in, that's my input. I want to remove everything that's not the first letter and not the last letter. So I'll remove things starting at index 1 and ending at the last index. The problem is this is not a thing you can do with strings. So this entire way of thinking where you're thinking about removing the middle isn't going to work. So when you're thinking of a solution approach, you have to have an intuitive idea about what are the basic operations that you can do. So here are the basic operations we can do. One thing we can do is we can get out a substring. So we could get a copy out of a middle section of the string. Something like this. So we can use that, we can do that with substring. A different thing we could do is we could get the length of the string. A different thing we could do is we could loop over the string one letter at a time. And that again would be substring. A different thing we can do is we can search for a string inside another one. So we could search for the location of like ST or something. So let's go back to thinking about shorten. If I have mellow and I want to remove the middle section, we don't have a good way of removing the middle section. And remember, strings are immutable, which means we can't change them anyway. So instead of thinking about changing the existing thing, what if I think about creating a new string that's just the first letter and the last letter? Well, now I have an idea, because I'm thinking, well, how can I get out the first letter? Well, we know how to do that. That would be input.substring, starting at index 0, ending at index 1. But you don't have to have that in your mind when you're making the plan. Our plan could just be something like this. F equals get first letter. E equals get last letter. And then I'll just return F plus E. So that's my kind of pseudocode idea. And now all I have to do is decide how do I get the first letter and how do I get the last letter. And substring lets us get out any portion of the string we want. So it could be individual letters, could be multiple letters. So let's proceed with a solution now. Whenever you're programming, it's usually a good idea to start with test cases before you actually implement your method. So let's do this. All system.out.println shorten mellow, which was one of my test cases. Well, let's just start with that one. All right, so now let's implement shorten. I'll go ahead and create the method. So public static should return a string. Its name's shorten, and I'll call the input in. So let's do my plan. I will say string first letter equals in.substring from 0 to 1. String last letter equals in.substring. And how do I get the last letter? It's like I'll need to get the index of the last letter, and that's just going to be in.length minus 1. The reason why minus 1 is the same reason as for arrays. Like let's say we've got the string ABC. String.length is 3, but if you look at the last index is 2. So the last index is always the number of things minus 1, because we always start with thing 0. All right, so I've got the first letter and I've got the last letter, and now I'll return first plus last. And now I can run it and verify that I do get MO. Oh, and now, oh, sorry. Other example things are going wrong. Hold on. All right, here we are. So it did output Mo. And I could do, whatever I want. Whatever I want. And this should output WT when I run it. And you can see that indeed it does, WT. Okay, but we also, these are kind of the expected inputs. But if you go back to the problem statement, there was an edge case, which is an unexpected input. So what if I just have the letter A? What should it do then? The original problem says that it should return the empty string if the input string is less than length 2. So right now, if I run it, we'll see what it does. So right now, it returns AA because I got the first letter in the string, which was A, and I got the last letter in the string, which was also A, and then I put them together. So if I want to be able to handle this kind of case separately, I'll have a statement to test for it. So if in.length is less than 2, then I'll return the empty string. Otherwise, I'll do what I'd planned to do. Okay, so now this looks like a good solution. I've got WT, and then for A, I just return the empty string. Let's do the next one. So count highs. I'm going to count the number of times high appears in the given string. I want to come up with my solution strategy first. And what makes sense to me is I want to start at the beginning and just check the first 2 letters and say, is that high? And then if the answer is no, I'll move on to the next 2 letters and check, is that equal to high? And then I'll move on and check, is that equal to high? So it's like I want to loop through all the pairs starting at the beginning and check each one to see if it's high. So for int I goes from 0 to the end of the list. This is pseudocode, not actual Java. I'll have a string called word that equals get 2 letters starting at index I, and then I'll say if the word is equal to high, then I'll increment a counter. That's the kind of solution strategy idea. And again, pseudocode, you wouldn't actually want to use the double equals. So let's now take the solution strategy and implement it with actual Java. So I'm going to comment out those 2, and I'll system.out.println count high for ABC, hi, ho, hi, there, hi. So this should output 3. Let's create the method. It's not going to return Boolean, it's going to return an int because we're counting. And then my input string should not be named that. I will call it in for input. So my general strategy is I needed a counter, and I wanted to loop through all the indices from 0 to the end, and that's going to be in.length. And now I need a word that's equal to 2 letters starting at I, but that's exactly what substring lets you do. It'll let us get out a substring, like a part of the string, starting at index I and ending at index I plus 2. And now let's check if word dot equals high, and if it does, I'll increment the counter, and then I'll return count. Okay, let's test it and see what happens. Aha, we have an error. It says string index out of bounds exception. And it says string index out of range 22. So the 22 is telling me what index was out of bounds. This is the line it's happening on. It's happening here, but that's inside the string class, and I didn't write that code. So this is the first line where it's actually happening for me. It's like the line of my code that caused the problem. Interesting. So why would this be causing a problem? One thing I'm noticing is I don't actually access I plus 2, because remember, you don't actually access the ending index. But I am trying to get the letters I and I plus 1. But what happens when my index is the last letter in the string? Like, what happens when I is pointed at this last space? I'll try and get the space and the spot afterwards. And that's what's causing the index out of bounds. It's because I don't want I to go all the way to the end of the string. So if I stop 1 early, so if I say in.length minus 1, that's the location of the last index. And I'm saying that I has to be smaller than that. So I can't be equal to the last index. So the largest thing I could be is the thing right before the last index. And is that what I want? if I is pointed at this second to last letter, then it's safe for me to get the letter after that because I haven't gone out of bounds. And that's also the final pair of letters that could possibly be the word hi. So I think I've done it. I've just decided how early do I have to stop I so it's still safe for me to get as many letters as I need. So let's run it again. And now the count is 3. Let's go ahead and remove all the highs and run it again, and the count should be 0. Let's try and run it on the empty string. Let's see if it, that's an unexpected input, but it still handles it cleanly. It's still saying 0. If I do hi, 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 I didn't actually count how many highs that was. Several though. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yep, 7. Great. So that seems to work. The next problem, double char. It looks like double char, I need to double every single letter. So if I'm thinking about how to do that, it says return a string rather than display it. If I was thinking about a solution strategy, I think my strategy is get each letter one at a time and then add that letter twice to an output string. So here, let's do it like actually in here. So I can say something like double string, I forget what it's called, hi there. So let's create the method signature. It's going to return a string input. So in pseudocode, it's like for each index I would want a letter, get the letter at I. But now I need to be creating my output string. So I'm going to initialize my output string to be the empty string, and then I'm going to say output equals output plus letter plus letter. So it's like every single loop, I'll take what my current output is, and then I'll add that letter twice onto the end of it. And then at the end, I can return the output. So let's actually do that in real Java. Oops, string output equals empty string, and then for I, and then in.length, and then string letter equals in.substring, starting from I, ending at I plus 1, because I just want one letter at a time, and then output plus equals letter plus letter. Remember, plus equals means take this and append it to the end of output. And then here I can return output. All right, let's run it. Yep, hi there seems to have worked just fine. Okay, last problem is called Bob there. And I want to count how many times Bob happens, except the middle character doesn't have to be an O, it could be anything. So here, I'm not counting it also, it's just true or false. So here it returns true because there really is a Bob. Here it returns true because there is a B followed by something followed by a B. And this returns false because that pattern doesn't exist. So let's, just like we usually do, come up with a solution strategy. So here I'm making Bob there. My input says hello B9B forever. I want it to return a Boolean. The input is in. So sometimes a good way to come up with a solution strategy is to ask if this problem is similar to a different problem that you've solved in the past. And to me, this feels a lot like the problem where I'm counting the number of times hi happens. Because in that problem, I'm looping through pairs of letters trying to look for something. And in this case, I'm looping through, I'm imagining I'm going to loop through 3 letters in a row trying to find something. And the thing I'm trying to find is this pattern that looks like B something B. So let's pay attention to what's the same and what's different. What's the same is I can loop over the indices one at a time. And then I could try and do this, string word equals get out 3 letters starting at I. But before, I did something like this. If word equals hi, then increment a counter. In this case, I can't directly compare with an equals sign because that center letter could be anything. And I don't want to have a bunch of if statements that says if it's Bob, then return true. If it's B9B, then return true. If it's BQB, then return true. If it's BZB, then return true. Because there's too many possibilities there. So instead, let's think of a way to rewrite my test. What I'm really interested in is whether the first and the last letter are both B, and the middle letter could be anything. So if I've already gotten out 3 letters, I can check to see if first letter of word is B and last letter of word is B. So if both of those are true, then I can immediately return true because I found Bob, or I found, a Bob-like thing. And then if I get to the end and I never see that, I'll return false. So this now seems to be a workable strategy. So let's do it. So I'll loop through the end of the string, although I'm remembering last time that I went out of bounds, and so I want to kind of think about that again. So word equals in.substring from I to I plus 3, because I'm trying to get 3 letters. And let's go ahead and get out the first and last letter. So first is word.substring 0 to 1. Last will be word.substring from 2 to 3, because if I think about a 3-letter thing, the index of the last letter is going to be 2. So my first letter was starting at 0, ending at 1. My last letter is starting at 2, ending at 3. And now I can say if first equals B, and if last equals B, then I'll return true. Otherwise, at the very end, I will return false. And this is pretty good, except for that out of bounds issue that we need to think about. So let's think about it this way. Because I'm getting out 3 letters at a time, I'm always going, here, so let's say I've got some string, and I'm like in the middle of the string somewhere, okay? Let's think about the largest thing I will ever access. So let's call let's say this is index I. And so then the next letter is I plus 1. And then the next letter is I plus 2. So using I as a reference, the largest thing I'm ever going to access is I plus 2. And I want to make sure that that stays in bounds. So this way of constructing my for loop is saying the letter I always needs to be in bounds. Like the letter I can't get too big. But I'm accessing locations past I. So I'm going to modify this. Instead of saying I has to be small enough, I'm going to say I plus 2 has to be small enough. Because that's the location that I'm actually accessing that can't go past the end of the list. So that's a nice way to think about how to modify your loop boundaries. Let's run it. Okay, so it said true, which is what it should say because that does have a Bob in it. If I remove it, now it should say false because I don't have that pattern anywhere. And it does. Okay, I hope that this was helpful.